Of all of the actions to be taken during the second Trump administration, we need to realize that one of the most impactful very well may have already been taken within the first month of Donald Trump's second term back in office. And what might that be? It's the dismantling of USAID. And what is this organization, you may ask? Well, it's the United States Agency for International Development. When you hear USAID, you think of an entity that assists the poor, the downtrodden, the suffering, people who are starving, malnourished, in destabilized societies. But that's not what you have here. You have nothing more than a hollowed out cookie cutter organization that does the subversive bidding of the intelligence community. That's right. All of those different things that the CIA can't get that presidential stamp of approval on, well, they just route those actions through an entity like USAID. And because of that fact, the exposure of an organization such as this will be able to assist in rooting out what? Government corruption at every single turn. Because what you need to realize is that USAID, well, it's had its fingers in just about every single pot that you can possibly imagine. So now let's go ahead and jump in and see what we've got with the absolute utter insanity of what USAID has been doing on the world stage and what its exposure very well may mean for the future. Jumping in now with the Washington Post, here we see Trump 2.0, the most damaging first 2 weeks in presidential history. Trump's second term is all about curtailing government's power and reach. And yes, that's exactly what the people voted for. Another thing the people voted for tangentially was Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, which I find it hilarious that we see like the media class and just these shit for brains idiots online. Oh my gosh, don't you understand? This is a billionaire invading politics. He's gonna make politics like a corporation. That's how this has worked the entire time. But not only that, it's hilarious that it's now a problem simply when someone who's in your opposition is now doing it. You had no complaints when the fact of big money was invading politics for ages, buying off your politicians and making them nothing more than lobbyists for these massive institutions. You didn't have anything to say about that, did you, journalists? No. It's only an issue now that we're restricting government power. And of course, the reason these articles are being written is because institutions like USAID, well, they're the ones funding outlets like the Washington Post, Politico, the Associated Press, the New York Times, need I go on? And then, of course, these outlets that were used as effectively proxies to provide information to the American people and the world at large were then used as sources by places like CNN, ABC, CBS, Fox News, and so on and so forth. So what we see is we are truly living in a USAID Truman Show, and there is no better way to put it, because in so many ways, all of the narratives that we've seen, well, they're nothing more than felonious, and it's been constructed truly a carnival class just act of House of Mirrors nonsensical bullshit. There's no other way to put it. Moving on now to some more nonsensical retardation that I truly must admit is absolutely stellar when you consider what this shows, is the fact that even the BBC is openly talking about the fact of the threat to global health if the US freezes overseas aid. Of course, like I stated, we're not talking about food and water going to starving children that are being made into, what is that? Oh yeah, slaves in places like Burkina Faso so they can go mine cobalt. No. What we're going to do is talk about the fact of how important it is to make sure that we can have $10 million going to Pakistan for gender studies. This is the nature of what we're dealing with. And not only that, but we see the fact that places like USAID, which, like I stated, a CIA cookie cutter organization that does the bidding of the intel community without the president's approval, well, they're actually funding outlets across the world, even those of, like, the BBC, which is the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is supposed to be funded by, oh yeah, who is that? The British taxpayer. But it appears it's also being funded by the American taxpayer as well. And it's not just that of the BBC and American outlets that are getting funded by USAID, but also outlets in both Ukraine and Russia. Here we see from the Washington Post, the independent media in Russia and Ukraine have lost their funding with the USAID freeze. Independent media in Russia and Ukraine have been critical of their governments and provide alternative reporting, but much of it relied on US grants. So what we're seeing is this independent media, which was anything but because it was funded by US intel agencies, very clearly is doing what? It's fomenting dissent within countries by spearheading Western media narratives within these nations and doing so to propagate what? Destabilization. And I'm not saying this in favor of the way that Russia handles their media or Russian government or Ukrainian media. No. I'm here to simply talk about the fact of how it is openly clear to the world that the CIA has influence across the entirety of the media landscape, and that Operation Mockingbird, it never died. It just expanded its grasp across the entire world itself. And here's a perfect example of exactly that. USAID's funding to over 6,000 journalists on over 1,000 platforms worldwide has raised concerns over independence and transparency. And if there's anything that the intel community doesn't want, it's independence in media and transparency of what is being talked about. So, what we need to go ahead and address now would be something that I thought was just absolutely gangbusters to be brought forward to the American people by that of the White House press corps, and it's that of what we see here from CNN Business. The White House says it will cancel $8 million in Politico subscriptions after a false right-wing conspiracy theory spreads. That's right, conspiracy theory, you see. Of course, we see an outlet like CNN that is effectively doing the bidding of the CIA by propagating the narratives that they spew, is using a term that was created by the CIA, conspiracy theory, which was coined after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, so that they could tar and feather anyone who was asking questions about why it is that the assassination of JFK just didn't seem to make any sense. But of course, we don't need to talk about anything like that here at CNN. What we need to do is tar and feather you as a right-wing conspiracy theorist, even though it's not a conspiracy, because you can openly go to American websites that are created by the US government itself, with domains that are held by the US government, to look and see this funding. Here we see from usaspending.gov. What is that? Oh, it's the money that's been siphoned into Politico's coffers. And in fact, we see that they had roughly 42 subscriptions, which was to the tune of roughly $1,200 of subscription, so should have been tantamount to roughly $50,000 to $60,000. And in the end, the price that they were actually paying for these subscriptions was roughly $500,000. So what do we see here? Ah, yes, money laundering. Who would actually be surprised? And you know what you also shouldn't be surprised by? Why it is that so many of these outlets like Politico, CNN, and all of these others are freaking out. Because look here, what we see is Politico's funding, well, as we see at the beginning of 2025, it's officially dried up. For the first time in ages, there has been no one at Politico that was paid. And with that, we understand what? That effectively, like I stated, we're living in the Truman Show, and USAID and the CIA, along with the amalgamation of the other Five Eyes nations and their intel communities, have been effectively constructing a narrative that we've all been walking through, and with that, none of us have even realized the world that we've been living in. So now let's go ahead and throw it into the thing that ended up revealing this information about Politico specifically having their funding cut, and it was in the White House press corps when Donald Trump had his White House press secretary speak to the world to openly announce that as they're going line by line throughout the federal budget, they found that, well, it seems USAID was funding the media class, and with that, the media class propagating those narratives has now had their funding stripped, and with those journalists that were in the room from Politico, you have to wonder, what is it that they're thinking now? Because now there's no money funneling into their pockets, and they know damn well sure that they provide no value. So with that, what is it that they're going to do on the horizon, and how hysterical will the media get? So now let's go ahead and throw it into that clip from the White House press corps, and then we'll jump ahead to some examples of the absolute batshit banana bonkers nonsense of what USAID was funding across the globe.
So upon coming out here to the briefing room, I was made aware of the funding from USAID to media outlets, including Politico, who I know has a seat in this room. And I can confirm that the more than $8 million taxpayer dollars that have gone to essentially subsidizing subscriptions to Politico on the American taxpayers' dime will no longer be happening. The DOJ team is working on canceling those payments now. Again, this is a whole of government effort to ensure that we are going line by line when it comes to the federal government's books. And this president and his team are making decisions across the board on, do these receipts serve the interests of the American people? Is this a good use of the American taxpayers' money? If it is not, that funding will no longer be sent abroad, and American taxpayers will see significant savings because of that effort.
In many ways, I never thought I'd see something like this coming from the Republican Party, outside of that of someone akin to Ron Paul, Thomas Massie, or Rand Paul. The fact is that what we see is conservatives and Republicans finally actually stepping up to the plate with some ferocity for once to address the topic that they've claimed for so long to care about. And what might that be? Well, it's big government spending. Of course, as we know, conservatives and constitutional conservatives themselves have done nothing more than hand-wring the concept. Meanwhile, completely abandoning the topic at every single turn to lick the boot of the Orwellian nanny state, and in the process subjugate your freedoms and your tax dollars to the machinations of institutions like that of USAID. So what we understand is that while the actions of the Democrats to go ahead and advocate for policies that expand the capacity for government have been a limitless and persistent push for generations, we need to realize that the Republicans bear responsibility because they have operated as nothing more than a speed bump for the Democrats rather than a hurdle or a barrier to stop the expansive bloat of government and bureaucracy itself. It's truly remarkable. I never thought I'd see the day, but you know what else I never thought I'd see? Millions of dollars for condoms in Afghanistan, or hundreds of thousands of dollars to promote atheism in Nepal. Here we see USAID's controversial spending, and we'll be diving into this in just a moment, but the thing that I want to tackle specifically here would be the hundreds of thousands of dollars spent to go ahead and export atheism to numerous different nations, including Britain itself, and a litany of other different countries across that of the Middle East as well as Asia. And why is this an important thing to pay attention to? Because, well, these nations that are incredibly religious and completely devoid of a secular structure, well, what we understand is if you're going to be implementing, measures that will be, let's say, sowing division within their culture, what you will do is create societal destabilization, which creates chaos. And if there's anything an organization that would be working at the behest of the CIA would desire, it's chaos so they can exploit it. So just for a moment, let's go ahead and take a quick gander at Nepal's religious demographics. Hindu coming in at the top with 81.19%, Buddhist with 8.21%, Muslim at 4.39%, Kiritist being the indigenous ethnic religion of the region with 3.17%, Christian at 1.76%, and Sikhs at 0.01%, and Jains at 0.01% as well. So what we need to realize is through the process of the implementation of these measures that we see by pushing atheism in a society such as this, all it will do is sow societal discontent, which, like I then said, will create chaos, which can then be exploited. And when you look at the position of a country such as Nepal on the globe, you realize that it's close to Tibet, which is close to China, which would mean that what we're doing is destabilizing a nation within that of China's sphere of influence, which then puts pressure on China to handle an issue. So what we can see is, in many ways, this could be used as what? A tactical issue to make sure that we are assisting in spreading our opposition's resources as thin as possible by making sure that we're destabilizing societies across the globe. And in the process, it doesn't matter who has to suffer. That's never going to be an issue. All that matters is that the end goals of the intelligence community is met, and that's exactly why you see actions such as this being taken. When you get down to the brass tacks of it, it is comically evil. It is literally supervillain level shit. But anyways, let's go ahead and move on now and speed run so many of the different things that USAID was funding. And to start that, here we see from whitehouse.gov. For decades, the United States Agency for International Development has been unaccountable to taxpayers as it funnels massive sums of money to ridiculous and, in many cases, malicious pet projects of entrenched bureaucrats with next to no oversight. Here are only a few examples of the waste and abuse. $1.5 million to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in Serbia's workplaces and business communities, $70,000 for production of a DEI musical in Ireland, $2.5 million for electric vehicles in Vietnam, $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia, $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru, $2 million for sex changes and LGBT activism in Guatemala, $6 million to fund tourism in Egypt, hundreds of thousands of dollars for a nonprofit linked to designated terrorist organizations, even after an inspector general launched an investigation, and millions to EcoHealth Alliance, which was involved in research at the Wuhan lab under the leadership of one Dr. Anthony Fauci. But wait, it gets even more ridiculous, and trust me, ridiculous is absolutely the correct word to use here. Here we see from Real Clear Politics, running lizards on treadmills cost taxpayers $1.6 million, but that's not just it. They wanted to test shrimp too. $1.3 million paid to put running shrimp on treadmills. This is not an exaggeration. And my goodness, when you read something like this, you truly wonder, how is it that the eggheads within the United States government came to the mindset that it was viable to spend this much of the taxpayers' money on something as utterly fucking retarded as this? Anyways, moving on now, here we see feds dump millions into one Latin American country to fund sex changes, LGBT activism, and more, and that country being Guatemala. Jumping on now here to the Daily Caller once again, I guess, unintentionally, here we see the same exact thing, but nonetheless, now we jump to Fox News. U.S. taxpayer-funded programs teaches Sri Lankan journalists to state pronouns and avoid binary gendered language, and this was a program to the tune of roughly $2.5 million that was effectively creating university-style classes to teach journalists to use pronouns. Where is all of this money going? Because there's absolutely no way it's being funneled into these projects, so clearly what we have is another example of money laundering. Moving on now, here we see one of the biggest factors as to what needs to be talked about when it comes down to USAID, and that would be that they were one of the key factors that drove the Trump-Russia collusion hoax, which is what whipped up the mind in so many people that we have to be so vociferously against Vladimir Putin and what he's doing in Ukraine, which by all means, he is not justified with the fact of the lives that he has caused, but you have to understand the historical ramifications have built up to this point that have made the actions taken by Russia justified in their own eyes. But of course, that's not going to be something that we talk about in the media. We're just going to talk about how Donald Trump is effectively a puppet of the Kremlin, and for 8 years, smear him as nothing more than a Russian asset, which in doing so will whip the American people, specifically the left and the Democrats, against Russia. So once we see a conflict like this on the horizon, no matter what happens in the end, those of the left who are so vociferously and intently aligned with that of the narrative being sold that Donald Trump is a Russian agent, well, they'll do anything that they can to support Ukraine, even if it means spending hundreds of billions of dollars, impoverishing themselves and their own future generations in their own nation, because by God, don't you understand the orange man is a threat? Because don't you realize that's the way that we have to talk about this? And there you have something that's most interesting. Right once you see the shift of how this USAID funding has been cut off, immediately the media class stops talking like that of nothing more than petulant children trying to propagate high school level bullshit to complain about the orange man, and now they're actually trying to talk about things that matter because they realize they now have to curry favor with the American people. And here is that example of exactly that. From Politico, this just dropped on the 5th. Voters were right about the economy. The data was wrong. Here's why unemployment is higher, wages are lower, and growth less robust than government statistics suggest. But what you have to realize is, throughout the entirety of the Biden administration, all we saw was the consistent filleting of the numbers from the Biden admin, and in the process, it didn't matter how many of the cries were screamed into the ether by the American people. The journalist class did nothing more than call them what? Conspiracy theorists and maggots, because that is the way that they have to reference the people that disagree with them, is that in a dehumanizing framework, because otherwise they have no capacity to properly contend with the things that are being presented to them. I'm going to go ahead and call it there. Thank you for watching if you got this far. There's so much more to talk about when it comes to the USAID scandal, but nonetheless, I'll save that for another video when we dive into the topic of interviews. Thanks for watching. Stay lovely, stay great. Most importantly, tell someone you love them. Peace out.